In our description of our podcast, we wrote that we hope to bring accessibility to topics through expert panel discussions, historical patterns, and futurist trends. And I think today's conversation about educational movements will be quite interesting in that context. Thinking about my own educational experience on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm not sure how I could rate it. My 7th grade year was a 10 or plus. Loved that. Most of the rest of it, I'd have to put down somewhere between a 1 and a 3, I have to tell you. What about you, Amy? How would you rate your schooling on a scale of 1 to 10?
Well, honestly, Holland, that's kind of disappointing, but encouraging to think about a middle school experience being that high, which congratulations, that's exciting. I think mine was about an 8. I think mine was about an 8. Elementary was wonderful, very supportive. I feel like I retained a lot of information, maybe not all academic information. And I probably had room for improvement in my upper level grades, not necessarily based on the teachers and the schooling, but probably my own interest and lack of attention thereof as I went through intermediate and high school.
Well, there are major implications to having quality educated generation as we step into the next decade. And we've lost a couple of years due to the pandemic. I know we've talked about that. I've talked about that with other teacher friends. So this subject is a hot topic for parents, educators, employers, higher education people, and we need insight from our guests on this topic.
Hi, I'm Holland Webb.
Hi, I'm Amy Boland.
And you're listening to The Afterword, a conversation about the future of words.
So first we have Dr. Paul Thomas, Professor of Education at Furman University. Welcome.
Thank you.
And then we also have joining us at the Afterword table is Dr. Michele Dufresne. She is the president and founder of Pioneer Valley Books. And we are so glad to have both of you at the table tonight.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, both of you have multifaceted personal stories. So in 60 seconds each, would you mind sharing the Cliff Notes version of your life and who you are? And we'll start with you, Michele.
Okay. Well, I think pretty much my whole life I wanted to be a teacher. I had a chance when I was actually in high school to tutor a student that was struggling with reading, and it got me very interested in the topic. And much to my father's chagrin, I decided to go into education. My father was actually a professor at the University of Massachusetts in the School of Education, and he thought I should do something else, like be a nurse. But anyway, I went ahead and I ended up being a classroom teacher for a number of years. And then I actually went back to school to get my master's degree. And I was at the University of Massachusetts, and I ended up getting a teaching assistantship, and I was supervising student teachers. And I loved that work. I loved working with the adults. And so just because I loved that job, I ended up working on my doctorate. It wasn't something I intended to do. My husband was a physicist, and his dream was to have a PhD. It was not mine. But I just really loved the work, so I kept going. When I got into the dissertation, I was kind of sorry about that, but I ended up completing it. And while I was involved in getting my doctorate, I took a lot of courses in reading. I thought I was very knowledgeable about teaching reading. In fact, I really thought I knew everything. And I got a job as a reading coordinator at a local school while I was still finishing up. And through that process, the districts in Western Massachusetts were interested in reading recovery. And I hadn't really heard about it, but I was asked by my superintendent to get involved. And once I did, there was no going back. I have to say, the year I was defending my dissertation, I started my reading recovery training, and I realized suddenly that I knew nothing about teaching reading. And I had to rethink everything. And once I became involved in reading recovery, there was no moving away from that. It really did become my passion. And I became a reading recovery teacher leader. And so I had that chance to work with the adults that I liked, but I also had a chance to teach children every day. And I feel like that's really been the impetus that created Pioneer Valley Books. We didn't have enough books for teaching those beginning readers, and I started writing books and trying them out with the students and giving them to the teachers that I was working with. And it went crazy. The teachers loved the books. Our first set were little black and white books. And my husband ended up having to leave the university. He took a little leave thinking that he was going to help kind of straighten everything out. And I didn't want to leave my job, so I kept working for a real long time doing both. But now I work full-time for Pioneer Valley Books, and I really do miss my teaching and the reading recovery piece. But it's been exciting to grow business as well and see how much teachers love what we're doing and how we continue to help kids through that means.
It's interesting how you say you never get away from teaching reading. A friend of mine passed away a few years ago, and his wife holds a PhD in reading education. She's 104, and she reads to the other people at a Rolling Green Village down here, people who've lost their vision to glaucoma or age-related presbyopia, and she's still in the fight in a way. So you have a long way to go.
There we go. Hopefully.
Well, what about you, Paul? What's the 60-second Cliff Notes version of Paul Thomas?
Well, as you can hear every time I speak, I'm born and raised and lived my whole life in the upstate of South Carolina, and working class background, kind of the mid-century working class expectation of my parents was that I went to college. So I really liked learning. I wasn't that thrilled with school, but I loved my teachers and I liked learning. And probably simultaneously in junior college, actually, discovered that I was a writer and I was a tutor. My British lit professor asked me to tutor and learned, and I didn't expect it, but I learned that I liked literacy and I liked to teach. And, within a few years, I was a high school English teacher, and I was a high school English teacher in the upstate of South Carolina public school for 18 years. And toward the, 10 years into that, I went into a doctoral program, but I never intended to leave. I never intended to leave public education. But after 18 years, I did have the opportunity to get the position I now have at Furman. And it was really difficult to turn down because I really wasn't in the position to move, and that was still drivable. I didn't have to move. And so I've been at Furman now for 19 years, which is kind of a weird thing to say because I still feel like a high school English teacher, but now I've been a college professor longer. I'm in the education department, but I also teach first year writing. And moving to higher education has been really good for me because it allowed me to better pursue my career as a writer too. So I think I do very much miss teaching high school. But as Michele said a minute ago, pretty much my entire almost 40 years in education has been in literacy. And my background is really more writing, but I did my dissertation on Lula Brandt, who was president of NCTE and worked heavily in reading, but she also worked in writing. So I have a pretty good background in reading, although my actual teaching is more in writing.
Well, that's wonderful. And Holland, we know that's how Holland and I met in a children's novel writing class. We were thinking we were going to be children's authors, and that didn't quite pan out. Maybe will someday, but we decided to start a podcast instead. And I know one of the things that Michele and I believe in as reading recovery teachers is the reading piece and the writing piece go hand in hand. So it's so exciting to have you both here at the Afterword tonight. But I know a lot of folks and teachers and parents, many people don't understand some of the terms when we think about education. So we're going to do a rapid fire, quick vocabulary definition round. Doesn't matter who takes the word first, or both of you can take it. But let's kind of define our terms so that everyone's on the same playing field. So the first one is research-based. What does that mean?
Do you want to take that, Punk?
Well, yeah, I would say that's a really complicated one because it just depends on who's using the term. A lot of times, and more recently with the science of reading movement, and also going back to the National Reading Panel, some people will use that as a very narrow definition, just quantitative, peer-reviewed, so-called gold standard research. I kind of like the idea of evidence-based. And the evidence-based can mean, the experience of the teacher. It can mean qualitative research. So I would say the problem with that term for the public is it really depends on who's saying it. And I would say if you hear that or if you read that, you need to ask, what do they mean by it?
How about you, Michelle? That's good insight, Paul.
Yeah, I think that, probably going back to when Paul and I were in school, it really meant that we were going to do some, ethnographic study. We were looking at videotaping and transcripting what kids were doing and analyzing that to see patterns of learning. There's a real push now for everything to be a more experimental paradigm. I'm interestingly involved right now in preparing a research study that we're going to be doing on a big product that we sell, Literacy Footprints, and where it's really driven by the fact that in order to use funds from the federal government, it needs to have evidence and meet this gold standard that Paul was just talking about. But what's really frustrating as we get ready to do this study is the stuff that I know that's really important to learn and understand is really, really not what everybody is looking for. And really what they just want is test scores. Like, did the test scores go up? And having an experimental. So here's a big thing. We literally, the school district that's going to work with us, they can't give the teachers, half the teachers can't get the materials to use until after the study, because we have to have a group that doesn't get the treatment. And that seems like, I guess it's the same as you think about the vaccine. They gave the vaccine to some people and not to others. But, in this case, I don't know, that just seems like a hard thing. And then, the other thing we know is there's so many factors. And yet a lot of these studies just, we can show that it was our thing that worked because, the test scores went up. But there's economic factors and, students that don't come to school on a regular basis and teachers that are ineffective for various reasons. So, research is pretty muddy right now in education.
Well, I think that's why I wanted to throw that one out, because we do need to hear that. And I think both of you have really brought some excellent points, so that, just because something has research based on it doesn't mean that it truly is the best thing out there. Mm-hmm. So I really appreciate that. How about this one? State standards. Got a lot of people wondering about those things.
So there's been a lot of work to try and boil down what teachers should be teaching into what they call standards. And so these are, depending on, what curriculum we're talking about, but I'll just talk about reading. A state standard could be for kindergarten students to understand that, there's a title and an author on a book. So there's a list of these standards that it's supposed to unify what everybody learns, as opposed to the teacher making up their own mind what to teach. And then, of course, there's state standards, and then there was actually, standards that were across the whole United States, but that's kind of gone away, and now it's different states with their own standards.
Okay, excellent. Paul, any other insight on that?
Yeah, I would say it's really important to understand that the kind of standards movement started late 70s, early 80s, and it was very much state-driven. And I do think it is an assumption that you can prescribe or detail ahead of time what students need. And I think Michele was kind of pointing to frustration for me is I'm very student-centered. I think teachers look at their students. It doesn't matter what the standards are. You look at your students and you determine what do they know, what do they not know, and what do they misunderstand. And building from the student and providing them what they need is a completely different concept. But at least since the 80s, the United States have been trapped in the idea that we can determine ahead of time what every student needs, and we micromanage. It's, there's kindergarten standards, there's first grade standards, and it goes all the way up. And I would say what's frustrating to me is we've been doing that. In South Carolina, where I teach, we've had about 7 sets of standards, and we're never happy. And I try to point out to people that should tell us something. Maybe the problem isn't standards. Maybe there are other things that we should be doing. So I think sort of understanding the historical arc of that is really important.
Great. Does that go into then Common Core? Is that kind of where you all were leading a little bit, Michele?
Yeah. So so then, the states all had these standards, and then there was the Common Core state standards was kind of what every state was supposed to follow. And I think that there was some money tied to it. And, from the federal government, there was that movement. But then there was some backlash because, states wanted to change some words or whatever. Although if you look at, for example, the Florida state standards and compare it to the National Common Core, it's like, a few words have been changed. It's not really that different. I'm just talking about reading. I haven't read the math standards, or I don't read any other standards. So, but yeah, there's a part of me that says, we have these new teachers come out, and, a lot of them haven't had a lot of, experience to draw from. And so, to have something that kind of guides you is not a bad idea, but it is, a false sense of, we're going to cover all these things. We've covered all these things, and now we're moving on to this next list of things. Is just really not how learning works.
Okay.
Yeah,
how about you, Paul?
I think I would just add that, the standards movement in the 80s and 90s and into the 2000s was really governor driven. A lot of governors made their political career on our schools are bad, but I can fix them. And South Carolina had Dick Riley, who became Secretary of Education, and Dick Riley is wonderful. But really, he's a very good example of how governors turned fixing schools into political capital. And a lot of people miss the Common Core standards came out of the National Governors Association. The backlash was that it was associated with Obama because they gained momentum for the Common Core under Obama. It did not come out of the Obama White House. National Governors Association, a bipartisan movement, created Common Core. And what happened was, because of No Child Left Behind, saying that every child had to be proficient by 2014, people realized that some students in some states were being held to different, sometimes considered higher or lower standards than other states. So there became this ideological argument that we needed fairness. So we needed a kid in Nebraska to know that if they moved to Montana, that they would be stepping into the same curriculum, which I think is nonsense, but that was sort of the thinking. But Common Core did come out of the National Governors Association, but it was strongly associated with the Obama administration. So you saw this weird kind of conservative backlash against it because they associated it with Obama and with federal overreach. Neither one of those were true, but that's where sort of the backlash came from.
That's interesting. I didn't know that, Paul. I just knew that there was backlash, but I didn't know why.
Yeah. Boy, that history is fascinating. It puts a different light on it. So I'm hearing from both of you that, yes, it's important to have research, it's important to have standards, maybe not Common Core all the way, but what about norms? We have parents who want to know, where is my child? How does this work? And what is a norm?
Well, I would say a norm is a problem. Humans aren't normal. And I was going to say a minute ago, the problem with experimental research and education, Michelle's already pointed out one of them. To do it, you have to withhold education from people, which is unethical. So education is not medicine. And if you're a fourth grade teacher, you are not guaranteed a cross-section of students. You may have a room of outliers. Normalized research does not address outliers. So experimental research may say that most students benefit from this, but there may be students at both extremes that not only does not only does it not work for them, but it may even be harmful for them. So I think norming is a problem. It's a statistical necessity. It means something. I think with COVID, experimental research and norming is incredibly important. But I think for the average person, they should realize that education is not medicine and that there is no normal development of humans. There are predictable patterns. And I think sometimes we are able to say that there's a predictable sequence. The problem is that, to be perfectly blunt, there's no such thing as third grade reading. And some students are going to reach a level of reading in third grade, others aren't, but eventually the other ones will. So I think norms are problematic in the same way that I think experimental research is problematic for human development.
I am hearing it loud and clear. How about you, Michelle?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that, use testing and, looking for, where the average students should fall to make judgments that I think can be important. Like, for example, in reading recovery, which is an intervention for students that are struggling to learn to read, our goal is to catch those students up to the average band of the students. So we need to know, where do kids typically, fall? Where what is their reading? What would be the average? And we need to have an idea of what we're shooting for. But it's like this whole, idea that there's normal can really start to play, a mind game on everybody. Right now my grandchild is in first grade and she's very tiny. And physically she is, not as developed at the, when she went down steps, she kind of went to, foot, the kind of things that she just seemed kind of delayed in. But, oh my gosh, she's a beautiful reader. She can read much better than many students in first grade. So what's normal? Her mother is concerned that she, isn't as agile and thinks that maybe she should be held back. And I'm like, well, this is who she is. Why aren't we happy with who she is? And, just go from there. That's, this idea of what's normal can be, not healthy.
Fascinating. I think we're going to put Paul's little catchphrase on a T-shirt, Holland. Humans are not normal. That I think is a great hashtag. What do you think, Holland?
I think it's a great idea.
All right, we're going to round out this with one last theme: is generational education crisis or dropout. What is that?
Well, one thing I point out a lot in my work is that in the United States, we've always had an educational crisis, which seems kind of weird. I mean, every decade for over 100 years, there's been a public and political outcry that we're having a crisis, which I try to point out to people. I mean, years ago, the famous airplane landing on the Hudson, that kind of captured everybody's imagination. There's a movie made out of it. And that's a crisis. Like when that pilot realized that he had to land the plane. But education, struggles in education are not a crisis. They are a pervasive historical reality. A lot of my research is historically based, and the woman I did my dissertation on, Lula Brandt, reading her work in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, it's the exact same concerns that we have today. So a lot of children just aren't served. A lot of children struggle in their daily lives, and schools cannot correct that. I mean, living under the weight of poverty and racism and abuse and, neglect, and those are real things that children really actually should care more about than reading. I mean, if you're not getting regular meals, or if your parents don't have steady work and you're moving constantly, learning to read is actually less important than those other things. That was a truism in the 1920s in Kansas for LeBrant, and that's a truism right now today in any town in the United States. So I really bristle at crisis. I think there aren't educational crises the way we talk about them. And I think the problem with a crisis rhetoric is that we're not patient with how to address the problem. Talking with some other people, recently, and, research says it takes 10 years for change to show, and nobody gives anything 10 years. I mean, we don't even give it. I mean, South Carolina adopted Common Core, and before we could even implement it, we dropped it and changed our testing and our standards again. I mean, that's insane. We bought materials, we trained teachers, and then within 2 years, we dropped it because of the conservative backlash. So I have a real problem with saying that there is such a thing as an educational crisis.
Yeah, I'm concerned right now with all the talk about the current crisis, which comes from, obviously a lot of students had a very difficult time this year and last spring. We have a lot of students that had, were unable to, really participate much in the school process. And how we move forward in, next steps for those students, I think is going to be really important. And rather than look at it as a crisis, I hope that everybody is going to look at each child and think about what each child can do, and move from there, as opposed to, oh my God, they're so far behind, we need to remediate. There's probably going to be, we talked about that norm. There's probably going to be a bigger span. I think that there are children that had a great year. They were in little learning pods, or we turned 1 million parents into teachers. And and some of those children have thrived and maybe even done better. And so there's going to be a wide range, but each child is going to bring, what they can do. And that's where we have to move forward, instead of saying, oh, they're behind, and be all freaked out about it.
Wow. Excellent. This is such a great start. And I can already hear the passion in your voices as we get ready for this conversation to continue. So, Holland, do you feel like you've gotten a little educated?
Educated about education, right?
That's right.
The only non-teacher in the group. But let's keep talking a little bit about COVID. In 2019, there were 56 million school-age children attending classes in the U.S. Globally, there are about 1.9 billion children who are school-age, and we know that educating students is vital for communities to thrive and sustain further generations. But then something happened, and everybody went home. So what do you see as a positive educational practice that's maybe flourished during COVID? And what do you see as something that's negative that's come through COVID? And what would you really like to see continue out of what we've learned over the last year and a half? Can we start with you, Paul?
Sure. I would say the positive, it obviously wasn't worth it, but the positive is that it forced us to rethink our assumptions about sort of brick and mortar and face-to-face teaching. And I'm very much as I mentioned earlier, I'm a student-centered teacher, and even very young children are quite capable of learning in situations where they're not necessarily in proximity to or listening to a teacher. And I think COVID helped us look at like hybrid models and seat time and, where students are and where teachers are when we teach and when we learn. And that, that many teachers now have prepared videos and materials that students can access when they need them and can return to them. I think all that is a really good thing. And I mean, I've been very concerned for a long time about sort of the concept of seat time and proximity. I tell my students I teach college students now, but I've taught high school students too. And they're quite capable of learning without sitting in the room with me looking at them. And so I think, I think if we are rethinking all of those structures and if we do something about it, I think those will be quite good. Connected to that are some of the bad things, of course. One reason we think students have to be in the room with the teacher is surveillance. And, surveillance has really bumped up, teachers, are created structures for surveillance when students take tests online. I think those are very harmful. Forcing students to keep their cameras on for surveillance, I think, is very harmful also. But we mentioned this a minute ago. Probably the very worst thing out of this has been the concept of students need to catch up. And I've written several things about they're not behind. COVID was just a different learning experience. All students learn at some rate, and all students are at some different point than other students. And I really don't like, some of the ideas about like remediation. Remediation, that word has always driven me crazy because it's just teaching. All teaching is remediation and no teaching is remediation, because your job as a teacher is to know what your students know and what they need to know, and working with those two givens. And it just doesn't really matter if students are where we want them to be, because a lot of that is just really misguided. This assumption, we talked about it earlier, that all students should be at point X at a certain biological age has never really worked out that well. So, I would say the catch-up kind of concept that students have lost something or missed something, that's probably the worst thing that's come out of it, because I'm really worried about a new wave of accountability where students aren't given what they need, which is fine. If we measure what students know and then we give them what they need, I have no problem at all with that. But we have a tendency to be punitive. And you see in the science of reading movement, a lot of states are adopting grade retention, and that's just punishment. If kids aren't where they're supposed to be in third grade, we're going to hold them back. So, I mean, those kind of things are really awful, and I would say that's the worst part of COVID.
Thank you for sharing that. That could open up a lot more conversation later. But right now, Michele, would you sort of jump in and let us know what you think is good that we should keep and what you'd like to see curtailed post-COVID?
Yeah, I agree that there's, it's helped us rethink a lot of things. I think that, let's see, one of the things that was interesting to watch is, now I'm mostly, I work with elementary school teachers, and I think many of them were less comfortable with all the technology, and watching them take that on, even I have become much more comfortable. I know my way around Zoom now, and the coming together and working together, I think a lot of teachers really supported each other. There was a lot of we're in this together kind of feel. For us at Pioneer Valley, it really made us pivot. I have not been a great believer in using reading books on, with technology devices, mostly because probably I've never been one to, read a book on my phone or on my iPad. I really like a physical book, and I just really didn't see that as, an endeavor worth pursuing that much. But we needed to get books into kids' hands, and it was an emergency. And my son, who's a computer programmer and works for Pioneer Valley, basically in a couple of weeks created a digital reader. And through that process, we started training. It was very simple to start with, training teachers how to use it and doing webinars. And teachers around the world showed up. We had thousands of teachers coming to our webinars because they wanted to help their kids. They were desperate to help their kids. And so just seeing how much these teachers care and how much they wanted to help their kids, I think teachers get a bad rap a lot of times, that they don't care, they're just, whatever, they're in their teacher union and they don't. But what I saw was just incredible dedication, people working. I think for these teachers that were trying to, we had some teachers that were, teaching kids at home and teaching kids in their room. It was like really complicated. And, they just did the work. So, I think that there's new respect, as parents watched what teachers were doing there, I think there's new understanding that teachers are underpaid, that teachers are, and that the importance of teachers, how important teachers are to their kids. So all that I think has been a really great thing. But I think that, what it's exposed, it's not something that I was surprised by, but I think more people understand the huge discrepancy between the haves and the have-nots. We had children, where no problem, my grandchildren each have an iPad, and, the parents all have laptops and they have high-speed internet. So, they were all able to get on. And not only that, they had a grandmother that was willing to teach them every day, to help out. So there were all these resources, and grandparents chipping in. And then you had children where, in order to get them online, parents were having to go, and sit in the school parking lot, or, I listened to The Daily, which is the New York Times podcast, and they did a series on Odessa, which is a school district in Texas. And the high school kids, because they needed to work because their parents were being laid off, were actually on their class online with their, earbud and, making Frosties at the Frosty Freeze. It's just incredible how different experiences have been across the country. And then, just even issues of, for lots of kids, school is a place to get food. They got breakfast and lunch every day, and that went away. Obviously a lot of schools found ways, but I think we had a lot of hungry children. It's just been, and I think it was more displayed for everybody in a way that, it's been there, but it was more obvious. Not to be a downer, but
yeah, no, it's a reality. And that's kind of what we're looking at with these educational trends. And as you said, Michele, it's not something that's surprising. It was just put on display, and maybe that's a good thing. So let's shift gears a little bit and let's talk about theory. Both of you have a background in education and higher ed, but, parents and our average shopkeeper may not understand the differences between Freud's psychodynamics, Skinner's behaviorism, and Maslow's humanism. That may not make any difference to them. But we do have a multitude of theorists, and they share a way to teach children. So why do you think, and Michele, I'm going to start with you first, why do you think there are so many theories? And is there a benefit or a drawback to having multiple options for teaching and learning?
Well, I think that, from the beginning of time, people have been interested in how people learn. So there have been people out there that are trying to, observe the learning process and kind of describe it, and then find ways to apply it to teaching. So I think that one of the things that has pretty much gone on is, the next theorist that comes along is kind of built upon that, or, so I don't think any of these are really isolated. I think that they've built upon each other, and there's pieces that we pull. I don't think if you went into a school, you would find a teacher that says, well, right now I'm teaching this lesson based on so-and-so's theory. But that what we hope is as we train teachers to, how to help students learn, that we're drawing upon the theories that have been shown to work in terms of helping children learn. I mean, I think that there's so much that it's good to understand why you're doing something the way you're doing it, but then it needs to be how do we apply this, and the daily work that teachers do, and how has it proven to be effective. These kids aren't rats that we're putting through a maze. They're human beings that bring all kinds of different things to our classrooms. And so, learning how to observe and understand what you're seeing as a child is engaged in learning, and then what you can do to then support them is the important part of the theory, I guess. A lot of my work, of course, in reading recovery was based on Vygotsky's theories that really what we're looking at is, it's important to work in that zone of proximal development, which is, if you think about what a child is ready to learn, and you can help them by just understanding what it is that they can control, and we can get them to do a little bit more if we build from that, as opposed to trying to teach them something that's well beyond what they're ready to do. And that's what's going to be really important this year as teachers go back to school is, not to think about remediation, but let's observe each child. Let's use our tools that we have, assessment tools, to understand what it is they control, and then try and build from there. That's where I think the key is going to be to really helping every child and accelerating progress. So much of the time is wasted teaching them things they already know, or something they're just not ready to learn. Let's not waste time.
I love it. How about you, Paul?
Well, I try to, in my introductory education class, we talk about philosophy and theory. And there is an explanation for why we have so many, especially theory is just a lens. It's a way to look at things that narrows it down. So if you have a lot of different theories, reality doesn't change, but how you see it changes. And having that nuance, especially in a human behavior like teaching and learning, I think is incredibly important. And also, I back up to philosophy too, because you always have to ask yourself, why are you doing this? What is your big ethical goal here? And So in U.S. education, behaviorism is dominant. There really isn't a whole lot of, texture there. We make a lot of behavioristic assumptions. And I have ethical problems with some behavioristic assumptions. So I think you have to look at both, your ethical purposes and how you're looking at this, teaching, learning situation. And I would add, too, that I think there's a real reason that something like progressivism was so strongly attached to education, because it's pragmatism. It's, how does it look in the real world? And John Dewey did not have the impact on education that people often say. But I think Dewey failed to resonate with day-to-day teaching because he refused to give prescriptions. He was always, pragmatism is you as a unique teacher in a classroom with unique students have to figure out what to do. So he wouldn't give prescriptions. And I think that was a really important part of pragmatism, but it also is probably why it never really resonated the way it should have.
All right. So who's got a story for us about an educational trend that failed, or a story about an educational trend that maybe people were a little suspicious about, and then it just flourished?
I got lots of those. You want me to start?
Yeah, let's just do one. Let's just do one.
My failed story? I'll do my failed story. So my first year of teaching, I was hired as a third grade teacher. I had done my student teaching in a college town where we had lots of resources. If you had a child that wasn't behaving, you could pick up your phone and somebody would come and take them away. That was not true where I had my first job, which was a little community that had great economic stress on it. And I had 30 third graders. And I even had some desks that had those inkwells in it. It was long ago, but still at that time, they looked pretty like maybe they had been made around the turn of the century. But anyway, that was my classroom. I was so excited. I was going to change their world. And I struggled with classroom management. They were unruly. And I had 3 children that couldn't read. Now, when I say couldn't read, they could not read. And I had no clue what to do. And so I, went to the other teachers and they said, well, in first grade, they had the pre-primers. And then in second grade, they read the old pre-primers. So now we're going to go to the book closet or the book room and we're going to get you the old pre-primers. So that's what they gave me as advice of what to do with these 3 kids that couldn't read. So we started with the old pre-primers, which I think had been used even prior to my first grade experience. And at the end of third grade, they did not learn how to read. I failed. I think they must have had the old pre-primers the following year.
That's a tough trend.
Nobody knew what to do.
Yeah, that's a tough trend.
And I did teach a lot of phonics, by the way. There was a lot of phonics with that. I did a lot of phonics. I made phonics games. I had phonics worksheets. I taught phonics. They did not learn how to read.
Okay.
Wow. All right, Paul.
Well, when I was thinking about this question, I was thinking about sort of in the big picture. And when I was finishing up high school and going into college, the workshop method was moving into education. And you had a writing workshop, and then you had writing and reading workshop sort of popularized with Nancy Atwell and Lucy Calkins. And I really think that was singularly the best thing that ever happened in education. I think writing workshop in K-12 education, I went through the National Writing Project. I taught for a while in a regional, at Spartanburg Writing Project. I was the lead instructor for a couple of summers. And I think, the writing project and, writing workshop were excellent. And what happened, and I've done some scholarship on this, is the accountability movement just killed it. Every time that there's research done on students and writing, the research says students still don't write. And the workshop method was designed to give kids time in class to compose and revise and conference and get feedback. And I think there was a brief time where that was happening. And by the 80s and 90s, the accountability movement, so much focus was on reading and math, but so much focus when states were assessing writing were on one draft, very short, prompted essays that, when students do write in public school, they don't write very long pieces, and they're not getting a lot of feedback, and they don't do a lot of revision. So I think, to me, that's kind of a big story of not really failure, but a wonderful, wonderful movement that was killed by education reform. And I taught in the 80s and 90s in public school, and we did workshop. My students, when I was a public school teacher, I kept up with this stuff. I graded about 4,000 essays a year. And my students were very thankful, not in the moment, but when they went off to college, they were very thankful. And I think a lot of what we were successful, because they wrote so much. I don't know that I think in the early years, I was quite a bad writing teacher. I did some things that I'm pretty embarrassed about, but they were able to overcome that because they wrote, I had students writing, 20 and 30 formal essays a year. And, some of them had me 2 years in high school. And when they went off to college, a writing assignment was a breeze. That to me is kind of a big story. It was a good thing that we really had an opportunity with, but we killed it with bad educational reform.
I'm going to put a little more positive spin on that. Lucy Calkins and Donald Graves rocked my world. So I had that terrible story I just told you, but I knew that I was failing. And I went to a summer thing at the University of Massachusetts, and they brought in Nancy Outwell. They brought in some people. And that next year I was on fire. And a couple of years later, I taught first grade, and I put writing workshop in, and it was the kids, they love to write. And when I took a job as, I told you I was working on my doctorate, and I took a job as this reading coordinator where I got involved in reading recovery. Well, the first thing I did, there were 8 first grades, and they all did worksheets, and, they had a basal, and I put writing workshop in. I went into every single classroom and I put writing workshop in. Oh my God, that writing was amazing. And the superintendent was blown away because the test scores, which they were testing first graders with a standardized test, they improved 30%. Now that was before reading recovery. I know, and remember, I thought I knew a lot about reading, but it turns out I didn't. But I didn't know about teaching writing because of Lucy Calkins and Donald Graves. And I still see writing workshop in elementary school. I don't know what's going on in high schools, but in elementary schools, there are still large pockets of teachers that, and this is kind of a little fun aside. I have 4 grandchildren, but one is in kindergarten going into first grade, one's going into second grade, and one's going into third grade. And last week we started writing workshop. They're coming twice a week for an hour, and we do a little reading, and then each one is writing, and they made plans and they started writing. And the first time, Jackson, this one going into third grade, was grumping that this is what he would have to do with this summer. And I said, well, if you want to come over and you want to play with Papa after, you have to do this with me. And today they arrived, they were all on fire, and they got started writing. And when he comes home from work, they read what they've written to him. It's just great.
So this, Holland, is a sweet, sad, sweet story. It's like a Oreo cookie with all the cookie stuff in the middle.
Well, I'll tell you, I said I wasn't a teacher, but I did teach for 3 years. And
yes, you did.
Someone told me about Lucy Calkins, and I taught 5th grade, but I took the materials that she had written for early elementary and modified them and used them with 5th graders. And I thought, if I could do this all the time, this could be a career. Mm-hmm. But of course, you can't do it necessarily, but it sure was. It was a lot of fun and engaging, and yeah, it was unbelievable, the products that they were able to complete using that using that methodology. It was awesome.
Holland, was that when you were in Guatemala?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you were teaching in another country.
They were all ESL students. Yes.
Yeah. Amazing. That's awesome. So let's finish up this first part of our wonderful conversation with an essential element. So just one essential element, Paul, what do we need to know as we understand the trends in education? What do you think, Paul?
For me, I'm always big on historical context, recognizing that there's probably nothing anyone is saying, nothing anyone is doing that hasn't already been said or done. And we have a tendency to find ourselves in a hole and keep digging. We have a tendency to try to look for silver bullets. And many people have done that before. As I think I mentioned earlier, if you have 7 different types of standards and the outcomes are the same, maybe standards weren't the problem to begin with. So I think just having, I return again and again to my doctoral work, which was a biography. So I have this look at the history of education over quite a long time, from the early 20th century to the late 20th century, and it just fascinates me. I will pull things from the 20s, 30s, and 40s from journals that LeBrant wrote and share them in class, and people will think they were written today. So I think having a historical perspective and understanding that there are no new problems and there's no new solutions.
Interesting. All right, Michele, what's an essential element we need to understand?
I guess I'm going to say that that every child can learn, and that it's important to have good assessment tools so that you are observing what they can do and acknowledging and working from their strengths, from what they can do, and not looking at children from a deficit model.
So good. So good.
All right. Well, with that, we'd like to say a special thanks to Michele and Paul. This conversation was very educational. And to the folks who are sitting with us at the table, while you wait for part 2, please go to the afterwordpodcast.com and become a subscriber. You can leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts, and tell your friends about us, and share the podcast episodes that you enjoy on social media. And as always, remember that you are welcome at our table.